Alright, we're going to continue on now and take a more detailed look at the epidermis layer of the skin. So again, the epidermis is one of the two major layers of the skin, and it's the most superficial one there at the surface. So what do we have inside the epidermis? Okay, so most of your epidermis consists of keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. So if you remember from chapter 4, what does that mean? Stratified means you have layers of cells that make up that tissue. Squamous means the cells are flat. And when you have a stratified tissue, you name the tissue according to the cell shape at the surface, or at the most superficial portion, or the apical portion if we're thinking about something internal to the body. So squamous cells are flat. So the epidermis consists of many layers of flat cells, tightly packed together because it's an epithelial tissue. And then keratinized means at the surface is covered with keratin proteins. Keratin is a type of protein. So here's another example of proteins being very diverse in the body, having many diverse functions. And so keratin is a type of protein. You have that at the surface of your skin, and it is really the main thing that it forms the nice barrier we have there at the surface. So what kind of cells would you find in the epidermis? You have in there, most of them are what we call keratinocytes, and their main function is to produce lots and lots of keratin. This is a fibrous protein, so it has you know what a fiber looks like. Collagen fibers, elastin fibers, they look like strings or ropes. And so that's the case with keratin as well. Keratin, again, is a major barrier-forming protein that you have there at the surface of your skin. Melanocytes or melanocytes, you'll hear a couple of different pronunciations for those. Those are about 10 to 25% of your cells down in the deeper portions of the epidermis, so pretty close to the dermis. And those make a skin pigment. All right, a pigment is a chemical that has a coloration to it. So these cells make melanin. That's your main skin pigment that contributes to skin coloration. So it has a darkish brown color to it. Some additional cells that you have in there. You have some cells in there that are kind of spidery looking. They're called dendritic cells or Langerhans cells. Langerhans was the guy who discovered these cells. And they're kind of like guardians there at the surface of the skin. So if you have bacteria, viruses, things like that trying to invade from the surface, a lot of times those cells are successful at capturing them, so they help prevent infections. They also help activate your immune system as these microbes do try to invade the body from the skin, and you'll learn more about that mainly when you take your microbiology class if you haven't had that already. There also are some cells in the epidermis called tactile cells or Merkel cells that are touch receptors. So when somebody touches your skin, those cells get activated and it triggers nervous system signals that get sent to the brain, and you perceive that as touch. Okay, so here is a representation of the epidermis, and what you're seeing, one of these days I'm going to remember that I have to turn my pen on before I start writing on the iPad here. Alright. These are our sublayers of the epidermis. And what you're looking at over here, if you looked at the epidermis using a microscope in the laboratory, here you are, you're looking at a two-dimensional slice in this direction from surface to dermis down in here. You've got a 2D slice that way through the epidermis, and that's what you're looking at here. And then this gets dyed with a purple dye so that you can see the details a little bit better. And so again, you've got the surface of the skin is up here, And then down in here, you're seeing a little bit of the dermis peeking through right in there. It's lighter in color. All right, so the reason why this is so dark purple, all of this over in here is so dark, is because this is an epithelial tissue. The cells are very tightly packed together. Those cells are going to take up that purple dye, and so you have a dark coloration. Down in the dermis, you have connective tissues. Your cells are more scattered around. You have more extracellular matrix between the cells, and so it's not going to pick up the dye quite as darkly, so it looks lighter in color there. All right, so sublayers of the epidermis. So just some terminology review again. The epidermis is a major layer of the skin, and then the epidermis itself can be divided up into different sublayers that have different functions. So let's start down here at the bottom. The bottommost sublayer is called the stratum basale. Some people say basale. You'll hear different pronunciations for that. So like the name suggests, this is down at the base of the epidermis. It's just a single layer of cells down in here. All right, and they are bordering the underlying dermis. And this is where you have, it's a single row. The cells in here are mitotic. Mitotic means dividing. So those are cells that are capable of undergoing cell division. 1 goes to 2, 2 goes to 4, 4 goes to 8, etc., and so forth and so on. That process of cell division is called mitosis. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. Okay, so down in here in the stratum basale, that's the only sublayer of the epidermis where cells are actually capable of dividing. And as new cells are created, the epidermis is a very active layer here. As new cells are formed, they get pushed upward in the epidermis. You guys know you're constantly sloughing off dead skin cells. Well, where are the replacements coming from? They're coming from this stratum basale. As those cells divide, they create new epidermal cells, and those new cells get pushed upward. All right, let me erase all of that. Okay, so above the stratum basale, this next section you see in here from about, let's see, hang on, from about right there down to about right there, all of that area is your stratum spinosum. And in there you mainly have keratinocytes. Keratinocyte, site means cell. These are cells, one of their main jobs is manufacturing lots and lots and lots of keratin proteins. We said that's going to help form the nice tight barrier we have at the surface of the skin. So that's what those cells are going to be doing, and they're very tightly packed together. So they also help form that barrier that cannot be penetrated too easily at the surface. All right, and if we move up farther from there, right in here, you have an area called the stratum granulosum. And keep in mind, so as your epidermal cells are constantly being replaced and being pushed upward in a superficial direction towards the surface. So when you get to the stratum granulosum, you have these cells in there that used to be down in here. And the cells down in here came from the stratum basale. They just keep getting pushed upward and upward and upward. Alright, here's another thing. As these cells are getting further and further and further away from the dermis is where you have your blood vessels. That's where your blood supply is located. The blood vessels are bringing in your oxygen gas and your nutrients. You don't have blood vessels in the epidermis. There's no blood supply in the epidermis. So your cells up in here are having to get their O2 and their sugars and other types of nutrients. They're having to diffuse upward from the dermis. So guess what's happening to the cells once you get up in here. They are so far away from the blood supply down in the dermis, they no longer have a access to nutrients and oxygen gas, and so those cells actually die. So when you get to the stratum granulosum, the cells are deteriorating. It's called the granulosum because the cells in there take up a lot of the dye that they use, and you have granules in there which are actually membrane-covered vesicles that are filled with keratin and some lipids that the cells have been manufacturing that are going to help create the barrier at the surface. Alright, and when you get up here, finally your most superficial sublayer up in here is called the stratum corneum. Stratum just means layer. That's where that's coming from. Stratum corneum or corneum. This is your most superficial layer. In some parts of the skin, this is going to be a lot thicker than it is in other areas. You know, for example, on the soles of your feet, you know how your skin feels a lot tougher and thicker there. The stratum corneum is much thicker in that location than, say, the thinner skin that you have in many other areas of the body. When you have thinner skin, like say, you know, your skin is thinner on your forearm, on the anterior side of your forearm. In that location, you don't have a stratum corneum that is quite as thick in that location. The stratum corneum, once you get to that sublayer, the cells are dead, and all that's left are the keratin proteins that were manufactured down in here before the cells died. And then also you have glycolipids. Those are sugar-lipid combinations, sugar-lipid molecules that help form a nice tight seal and a waterproof barrier there in the stratum corneum. So those are your four major sublayers, but I'm going to add a fifth one in here called the stratum lucidum. Lucidum. In thick skin, you have an additional layer between or sublayer between the stratum granulosum and the stratum corneum called the stratum lucidum. And the reason it's lucid, it looks clear. The dead cells in there actually have a clear appearance, but you only see that on the in thicker skin areas, like on the soles of the feet. Alright, so the next few slides on here, I pretty much covered most of this information on the last slide as we were looking at the picture there. And sometimes I think it's easier to go over this information looking at a picture than just looking at words that are typed out on the slide. So I think most of this information has been covered. There are a few additional highlights here. The cells down in the stratum basale, that lowermost that lowest sublayer of the epidermis, those are where you have cells that are capable of dividing, and those are also referred to as a type of stem cell. Okay, they're stem cells because they are a source for additional keratinocytes that you're going to have as you move upward in the epidermis. Stem cells are cells that have not specialized into any particular cell type yet, so they have the potential to develop into other types of cells. And so as those cells down in the stratum basale divide and begin to move upward into the stratum spinosum, they do specialize. They take on this special function of cranking out lots and lots and lots of keratin to help form the barrier up at the surface when they eventually die and make their way up there. You'll sometimes see the stratum basale called the stratum germinativum, like germinate, because that is an area where you have cells undergoing rapid cell division. How long does it take one cell to go all the way from the stratum basale to the surface? It's about 25 to 45 days for them to make that journey. So that means you replace your whole epidermis, roughly about once a month to a month and a half. Just briefly, a little bit more when we're saying that these cells down in the stratum basale are capable of undergoing cell division. Just a little bit more about that. Cells that are capable of undergoing division are often said to be mitotic type cells because they can undergo mitosis. Mitosis is a process by which the chromosomes are the DNA molecules that are all bundled up nice and tightly in proteins to keep them all compacted inside the nuclei of our cells. Alright, so we've talked about before how the DNA, those chromosomes, are essentially your genetic recipe books for your cells. The instructions for how to make all of the proteins that cells in your body have to make are in those genetic recipes. So if a cell is going to divide, it has to copy all of those genetic recipes before one cell can become two. So that's what mitosis is. It's the process of copying the DNA molecules, copying those genetic recipes. Once that happens, then the cell can split into two cells, like they're showing you right over here on the diagram. See how you've got two, looks like a peanut there. That's one cell that is in the process of splitting apart into two, and that's going to take place after the DNA of the mama cell has been copied. Okay, now if you look in your textbook for information about mitosis, it's going to give you a whole lot of additional information. It's going to talk about the different stages of mitosis that have to occur to accomplish this. We're not going to go over that information. That's something you would discuss in an introductory biology class rather than an introductory anatomy and physiology class. And we simply don't have the time to devote to that level of detail on this topic in this course. I do want to talk a little bit about the cell cycle, though, because this comes up from time to time. The cell cycle is like a time clock for cells. There are different stages of the cycle that cells go through during their existence. And it's divided up into stages. There's one over here called G1, which G stands for growth. So once you have a new cell, so a new cell has been formed from mitosis, that cell's going to undergo growth. It's going to expand in size. It's going to manufacture all of its internal parts and its surface parts. And so while it's doing that, it's said to be in the G1 stage of the cell cycle. Now, if a cell doesn't need to divide, many cells in your body don't undergo mitosis. They're not mitotic. And so in that case, those cells will continue to hang out over here in the G1 stage of this cell cycle, this little time clock that we have here. Alright, but cells that are going to undergo mitosis, they move on and do some additional stages. So there's a stage here called S. S stands for synthesis. And it's more specifically referring to synthesis of DNA. This is where your DNA gets copied. You got to copy those genetic recipes. Once that is finished, the cell that's going to divide undergoes a new stage called G2. That's growth part 2. There, the cell is having to manufacture things that are going to allow it to take its copied DNA and separate it into two new cells that are going to form, and make the other machinery that's needed to actually split the cell apart. And then finally, you have the last stage, which is M, or mitosis, and that is the process by which, you started with one set of chromosomes, genetic recipes, you've duplicated those, now you've got to split them evenly. Each daughter cell that's going to form has to have a full set of genetic recipes. So that process is called mitosis, and as that completes, then one cell will divide into two, as you see here. So all of those steps are called the cell cycle. Just keep in mind that most of the cells in your body stay over there in G1. Some people call it G0 if a cell is in a resting stage and not all that metabolically active, not planning to divide, not needing to divide. So we'll hear a little bit about the cell cycle again when we talk about skin cancer later here in Chapter 5. Alright, I'm going to stop this particular video lecture here, and we'll pick up with the rest of the information on the epidermis in the next video lecture.